Hello, Valencia students, and welcome to our lecture number 19 in our course on Western civilization. We'll be looking at a very unique period in European history and the development of the Western world, an era referred to broadly as the Renaissance. To keep things in mind with the Renaissance, much like our lectures upon medieval Europe, is the term Renaissance is something that historians in Europe created in the early 19th century as they looked back over the last 1,000 years of the development of European history, asking how did they transition from a period of the dominance and glory of Rome to a period where they lived in small villages, fearful of the outside world, fearful of secular thought, science, and when was that spirit of the classical age reborn within Europe? The Italian word Renaissance means rebirth. What we'll see during this lecture today is a transition from the medieval world into what historians refer to as the early modern era, as Europeans remember their encounters with the rest of the world and particularly remember something about their own past with the legacies of Rome, Greece, and the ideas about science, philosophy, and the nature of what it means to be a human being. What is the Renaissance? What was the phenomenon about? When did it occur? And what helped to trigger this? Much like our concept of the word medieval, the term Renaissance was something that was invented by historians during the early 19th century in an attempt to try to periodize different elements of history. And what they recognize is for a period of about 300 years is that Europeans who had once been part of advanced Western civilizations remembered some things about their past and became reborn as major players and leaders within the world. What we'll see in this transition from the medieval to the early modern period is that people are going to look back to the past not to try to rediscover the negative things, but to try to find the aspects about philosophy, science, and a unique love of life that had dominated many elements of the classical world, and to try to bring these things forward into Europe and the modern kingdoms to see how life could be transformed. So broadly, we'll be speaking of a period from about 1300 CE up to around 1600 CE, and the main center of where this is going to take place is within the Italian peninsula. The main reason being is that much of what is going to fuel the Renaissance is an aspect of arts, literature, sculpture, and if you've ever heard the term starving artist before, unless an artist has a patron, somebody who will purchase their things, or as the great artist Mark Rothko once said, the point of an artist is to steal a place upon a rich man's wall. Unless Italians have this extra money to finance things, is that artists aren't going to produce these things. What they're going to do, though, is to try to form a specific sort of genre of art and humanities intended with a certain theme to try to improve the life of peoples throughout the European continent, to give them a new vision of the world around them. The Renaissance will broadly involve elements of architecture, traditional artists including elements of sculpture, philosophers, as well as writers. And what's important about the Renaissance and why people refer to it as the early birth of the early modern era is the Renaissance and the big picture of things, even though it's about arts and literature and all these things, is it creates a new paradigm within people's heads that's going to lay the basis for what I will term the European scientific revolution. And something to understand, the term scientific revolution, when we use it in Western Civ, is a highly loaded term, because many of the things brought about during the quote-unquote scientific revolution were already things that were well known and were the basis of many societies throughout the world. It's just that Europeans are going to engage with some of these ideas, remember that once they had been part of these ideas, and to bring these forward to give birth to the modern world. In our previous lecture, I ended off with telling the story of the rise of the Ottoman Turks as a major mover and shaker of the Islamic world and the reaction that many Europeans had against this, but particularly one of the main elements being the potential threats to the city of Constantinople. In our previous lectures, the Ottoman Turks had invaded elements of Eastern Europe. They'd taken over the entirety of the Anatolia Peninsula, and all that was left of the great Byzantine Empire was simply the city of Constantinople. And by the 1440s, Constantinople, it's just a sitting duck. It's a prize just sitting there waiting for somebody to snatch it up. The city had declined from its great peak of 500,000 people down to only 50,000 people. One of the main reasons being, as we had pointed out before, during the Third Crusade, the Crusaders, instead of going on to the Holy Land, the Crusaders torched Constantinople. Now, here's the great challenge that the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Emperor are going to have, is that they put out a plea to the Pope. Please help us, we're surrounded. The Pope said, only if you convert back to the one true Catholic faith and have all of your followers convert back and recognize that I am God's representative on earth. Quite literally, I am the center of all of the known universe. And the Patriarch and the Emperor said no. And Sultan Mehmed II came in, laid siege to the city, took it quite quickly, and renamed Constantinople to Istanbul. And as a symbolic aspect for the fact they had helped to take out one portion of the Abrahamic faiths, is that he moved his capital there and said, your former Christian capital is now the capital of Islam. In fact, he actually took it a step further. For a while, he was actually he put a hit out on the Pope's head. He put out a message to different Islamic warriors who said, if you can kidnap the Pope, capture and execute him, and bring me back his head so that I can say I've taken out all of the Christian kingdoms, we'll just say, after the legacies of the Crusades, Islam is no longer really thinking about itself in this period as people of peace with fellow people of the book, because they are looking to push Europeans out once and for all. Because the city of Constantinople, once it becomes Istanbul, is that Europeans now missed out on their major launching spot for any potential future invasions of the Middle East and the Holy Land. For the fact that the Bishop of Constantinople had to flee, the great patriarch of the Orthodox Church, he is going to flee to a city in the north in an area that we now call Russia, a city called Moscow. And that the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church has been the Bishop of Moscow ever since, and that particular faith is still centered in Moscow. Now, the other aspect where things are going to cause some issues is that Sultan Mehmed II says, Europeans, you can still come here and to engage in trade, and your traders can move through our areas. But here's the deal, is that every step along the way, you have to pay whatever taxes on merchandise that you're shipping back and forth, because we're the ones maintaining the roads, we are the ones keeping peace to keep trade going, and we'll see more and more as many Europeans who had gotten sort of hooked on fine products from China are going to say, well, we don't want to have to pay taxes, or that before, so they're going to start looking at the idea of sea routes to get to China versus the traditional land routes. And in the city of Constantinople, a huge number of intellectuals had still lived there in Constantinople. They had kept documents of the past, particularly, unlike the Roman Catholic Church, they hadn't banned the old Greek and Roman documents, so they had copies of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, things that were banned books in the rest of Europe. They packed up their libraries, they fled off to Italy, which means people are being introduced to ideas that had not really been around in Europe for close to 1,000 years. Now, a central concept brought forward in aspects of Renaissance thought and in the types of images that are going to be produced by Renaissance artists, the central theme of it is what we would call humanism. Now, to put that in perspective, humanism is not atheism. Well, we'll put it this way. While all atheists are humanists, the vast majority of people who are humanists aren't atheists. An atheist is somebody who rejects the concept of any gods existing, and they say all of our life should be focused here simply upon this one human experience, because humans don't have an eternal soul, so only have just one life to live. Humanists, well, they believe in focusing in here upon this life, but they don't believe in a larger idea necessarily of rejecting an idea of God or of an eternal soul. What they are rejecting is the concept of providence. The main idea of providence being, since God is eternal, the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end, is that God knows all things, God is involved in all things, and all things that happen are God's will. Is people said that a philosophy such as that, it keeps human beings stagnant, and that it puts us in a scenario where instead of trying to develop our own abilities and to define our own fate, is we're waiting for an outside force to intervene upon our behalf. So what humanism is about is centering in narratives and images upon the idea that human beings are the ones who define their own faith, not their own faith, their own fate. And that things such as knowledge, that knowledge offers a whole buffet of possible ways of looking at the world. That the only source of truth is not just the Roman Catholic Church and the Christian Holy Bible. Is that philosophers of the ancient past are also a great source of truth. Islamic philosophers also a great source of truth. Asian philosophers from all the way over in China are also an important source of truth. What they believed was by picking through these different concepts of truth and different ways of analyzing the world around them, is that human beings could intervene in their own affairs, chart their own destiny, and create a sense of progress within human civilization. The idea is that with each generation, we are taking steps forward, we are taking steps upward, and that each generation makes things a little bit better by building upon the past. And that the whole point of life is that we have one life to live, as far as we know and can prove, so that this one life should be embraced fully, particularly the old Latin phrase of carpe diem, seize the day. So, Renaissance stuff is centered around elements of creativity and of beauty. What Renaissance artists tried to do is they said, if there are all these different things that a human being can do, I don't want to become just a specialist in one thing. I want to become a specialist in multiple things. And for the fact that I have access to knowledge of the past and how different people have tried to interact with this world, is that if I embrace aspects of a education centered in the classical past, and if I look to a larger, broader world of knowledge, that I could be the absolute best that I could be. The idea is to try to build upon each step in life, to exercise one's brain, to exercise one's talent, and to try to create a phenomenon that makes human life seem beautiful. Up until this point, almost all aspects of European art for about 1,000 years were completely centered in upon religious stories. And that's not to take away from religious stories, it is because most people were illiterate. So the way you could teach your religious stories, and particularly in areas where the Mass was told in Latin, is you needed pictures to bring the story forward. What Renaissance artists are going to do, still, God and the divine will be part of their images, but they're going to try to take these things and give them a closer link with humanity, and the hopes that art, beauty, and new ideas could change this world for the better. That this life here, single life that we have, is not one that has to be condemned to evil and to horrors and to misery, but can be wonderful and joyous. So our most recent philosophy lecture focused in on this first individual, but to give a greater sense of who St. Thomas Aquinas is and why he has had such a long-lasting legacy upon the development of Western civilization. As St. Thomas Aquinas is going to emphasize almost all of his theological concepts on the principle of learning. At the time that Aquinas was born, he lucked out in very many ways. His family was an incredibly wealthy family. He was allowed to go to the University of Naples, which had just opened, and the University of Naples was the very first secular university in all of medieval Europe. Up until that point, every single university had been controlled by the Roman Catholic Church, which meant at the University of Naples, their library did not just have religious texts. It had Aristotle, it had Plato, it had all these books that were banned throughout the entirety of Europe, and Aquinas read these things and soaked them up. He's like, are we supposed to be reading these things? I thought it was just here to read the Bible. And I said, we do things here at the University of Naples a little bit differently. Feel free. Read all of the books that you want. And he became obsessed with the idea of looking at these ancient Greek thinkers and trying to find a way to blend his own faith in the Roman Catholic Church, his own role as a theologian for the Roman Catholic Church, with elements of secular knowledge. What he is going to do is essentially reject most of the ideas that St. Augustine had brought forward about the concept of original sin and that human beings were condemned to a certain fate here upon this planet because we were born evil. Aquinas is going to say that human beings are born in many ways simply a blank slate. We are neither good, we are neither evil, but we are pure. And that the world around us can shape us into being better people or into being worse people. And that if Christians are truly concerned about the salvation of one's soul and inspiring people to live a good and righteous life, then they needed to do their most to try to improve the world here around them. As a professor at the University of Paris and a full-time Dominican as well, how on earth he pulled this off? Put it this way. I've been a professor for around 20 years. I have so far pulled off publishing one book. He writes 40 in 20 years. It's because he's a man on a mission. As he says, there doesn't have to be a contradiction between faith and between reason and rationale, and he's going to bring these things forward, and more over time, the Roman Catholic Church has come to accept many of these ideas of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, a bit of a nemesis of Aquinas' ideas a couple of generations later. At least he's considered a nemesis, but I think it's a little bit off. The political philosopher, Niccolo Machiavelli. If you've ever heard the phrase, is it better to be feared or to be loved? This comes from Machiavelli. Machiavelli wrote a book entitled The Prince. Machiavelli had been involved in politics throughout his entire life. There, within Florence, Italy, he had been very close. He had been an advisor to the Medici family. He had watched multiple revolutions happen in Florence throughout his time. And his main concerns, he said, people talk about building a better world, and we should inspire this, inspire that. He said, the worst horrifying thing in the world is an unstable world. So he says, what do human beings desire most? Do they desire freedom or do they desire security? And that's been a huge debate in politics ever since. And he says they desire security. He said, so if one is the ruler and involved in politics, that you are above the traditional morality of other people. As he says, is it better to be loved or be feared? He said, the best of all possible worlds, it's both. He said, but if you have a choice, it's much better to be feared. That a leader should be clever, they should be cunning, they should be allowed to lie as much as necessary if the lies are to facilitate social stability and a greater common good. What we'll see coming out of Aquinas and Machiavelli is a bit of a dualism about the concept of education. Aquinas is going to say that education can help us to build a better world, to make better people, and these people will then be given salvation someday. Machiavelli says, well, if we're going to keep that world stable, we need people who are trained in politics. And that this political leadership of the future, we can't just have it born like, oh, I'm king, and I'm the son of the king, so therefore I get to be king, and I'm the grandson of the king, so someday I get to be king. He said that's stupid and ridiculous. As he said, we need people who are trained politicians, because if somebody has no experience in politics and then tries to hop in to major positions of power, they may be highly ineffective and may cause a lot more harm than good during periods of crisis. Machiavelli says, even if the leader is a lie, as long as it's a lie that people agree to believe in and that they provide stability and order, that this is what human beings truly desire. Now, one of the most essential elements to understand about artists of the Renaissance era is the aspect that fierce competition played between them. So we'll look at three of the major artists of the Italian Renaissance, not to be confused with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We'll look at Michelangelo, Raphael, and the one known as the Master, Leonardo da Vinci. So Michelangelo, born in the year 1475, is going to be known for his incredibly inspiring imagery that tries to give a very poignant message about the future of humanity. Michelangelo was known as what we would call a Renaissance man, which we'll look into in more detail as we talk about Da Vinci. He was a sculptor, he was an engineer, a painter, an architect, a person who sought to specialize in all sorts of things, and he lived a very long life and produced a huge number of pieces throughout his life. One of his most important pieces, the statue of King David that he produced in the year 1501, took him 3 years of working on this thing. The thing is 17 feet tall. It is located in the Italian city of Florence, which was a center of wealth and power. And what's important is there's two defining features of David. Number one, he's nude. Medieval period, you're not supposed to show the naked form at all. That's an old pagan Greek and Roman thing. And do you show the king of the Jews, the first king of Jews, as being naked? Very questionable. But number two is the where King David is placed, as he is not facing towards the holy city of Jerusalem, is he is facing towards the city of Rome, giving deference, the first king of the Jews, giving deference to, according to Roman Catholic faith, the other king of the Jews and the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. For the fact that he was willing to do such controversial things with religious imagery, he was actually hired on by the Roman Catholic Church to do artwork right there within the Vatican. So at the Sistine Chapel there within Vatican City there in Rome, as he was hired on to do a number of murals in the room just outside of where Catholic bishops meet when they choose the next person to be Pope. Many of the walls that he was given to do involved elements of trying to tell the story of the Bible. But along with this, as he was also supposed to do paintings of the entire ceiling. This particular piece, he started in the year 1508. It took him almost 5 years to complete doing this entire room. Each single part is done to exact perspective, exact scale. It was done in what is called a fresco style, so where the paint is actually put into a wet plaster in the wall, so it still survives to this day, although it's had to be restored a few different times. But if you can imagine this, if you've ever tried painting, standing in front of a nice paint easel, standing up, your arm gets sore, your back gets sore. Imagine being on scaffolding, painting on your back, paint drips down, all sorts of things, and doing this for several years of your life and creating one of the most amazing masterpieces of all time. And a young whippersnapper competitive artist named Raphael going, well, Michelangelo, if you think you can do well, Roman Catholic Church, I can do even better. Raphael, born in the year 1483, tried to produce elements of images to try to nurture elements of young people's expression. And Raphael, like most people, is a product of his own upbringing and environment. Of the 4 children born into his family, he was the only one who lived past the age of 5. When he was 9 years old, his mother died. So he is a person who has elements of a disconnect from mother and looking for ways to try to reconnect with some type of parental figure. And this is where these themes come through with elements of his own paintings. Throughout his career, he did a number of different depictions of the Virgin Mary, a specific way of looking at the Virgin Mary referred to as the Madonna, where it is the mother embraced with the baby child, Jesus. And in each of these paintings, there is a distinct motherly connection between the mother and the child. He also did multiple paintings of not just mother with child, but adding in the cousin, John the Baptist, as well, of trying to figure out what that unique connection would be, because mothers already have a unique connection with their children, but if you know your child is someday going to die to save the world from sin, that's an intense, unique connection. Why does he feel such a unique connection with mother? As the psychologist Sigmund Freud would say, he lost his mother early on. He needs a connection. But he's also trying to bring forward different aspects of Christian faith that had been marginalized by this point, of the important role of women. Along with this, once Michelangelo was getting commissioned by the Vatican to do all sorts of paintings, Raphael threw his name in the lot as well. Raphael was given 4 different rooms right there within the Vatican to portray elements about not just the Christian past, but a pre-Christian past. And one of the most famous paintings he did was an entire wall simply entitled The Academy. It was a throwback to Plato's Academy of Ancient Athens. Pictured within the particular piece is almost every great philosopher of the pre-Christian world. So central in the middle, Plato walking with Aristotle. Diogenes is in there. The prophet Zoroaster is in there at different points. He's thrown in all these pagan philosophers that before the Renaissance, one was not even supposed to read these people's things, let alone make huge paintings of them right there in the heart of the Roman Catholic Church. What he's trying to show here is that in modern times with the Renaissance is that people can both have a faith in Christianity and to look back to aspects of the past and to create a visual language that connects past, present, and a vision of the future. So in this next slide, we're going to look at a very short clip of the work that Michelangelo did in the Sistine Chapel, particularly focusing in on the image of Adam reaching out and touching fingers with God at the moment of creation. So the individual considered the greatest of all of the Renaissance artists, and considered by many historians to be the most talented human being ever to live on planet Earth, Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci is the embodiment of what we would call the Renaissance man, a person who dedicated their life to try to learn everything. And what I mean by learn everything, to become an expert at every single skill base possible, and to use that to create new knowledge. To differentiate, somebody who is a Renaissance man is different than the phrase if you heard somebody say, oh, I'm a jack of all trades. Jack of all trades would be, like my father said, somebody who knows just enough about his subject to potentially be dangerous. They're not an expert. They just know a little bit about a whole lot of things, and they think they can tinker with a whole lot of things, and like many, particularly this is something I associate oftentimes with men, myself, I tinker with all sorts of things, I mess them all up. I'm an expert in like 2 or 3 things. I'll never be an expert in multiple things. Da Vinci is an expert in everything, and is known throughout his life as the great master. He is the symbol of the Renaissance. He is a painter, he is a scientist, an inventor, an engineer, a sculptor, a writer, an architect. Oh, and his work ethic. And this is a message to those of you who are procrastinators, people highly distractible. One might use the term a little bit of ADD, attention deficit disorder. Da Vinci is the poster child of ADD of the Renaissance, but here's the thing, is he understood how to work with it. So as a fellow person suffering from ADD, I can connect with Da Vinci, procrastinate, but then turn around, you can distract me, give me a challenge. I'll wait till last minute, but the product that I come up with, for the fact that I want to take great pride over it, and that I want it recognized and validated, is I'm highly competitive. And my rivals, if I have somebody who has said, I am your rival, I'm like, good luck. It's because I grew up obsessed with Leonardo da Vinci. I thought he was the coolest of the Ninja Turtles, of Renaissance masters. Let's look at a few pieces from Da Vinci to try to understand why he has had such a long-lasting legacy, particularly our fascination with him when it comes down to aspects of popular culture. Apparently, Da Vinci once said, painting is poetry that is both seen and felt. And in 1498, he began work on one of his most famous pieces that has gone down throughout popular culture in so many different ways of trying to understand the symbolism, the beauty, the intensity. The Last Supper, the moment of Jesus of Nazareth meeting with his 12 disciples and going through, this is my body, this is my blood, admitting that he had been betrayed. Within this picture, the three windows in the back are supposed to represent the Holy Trinity. It uses a neat, unique element of one-point perspective where Jesus is central to things. It's had even greater interest over the years because the Church of Santa Maria in Milan, where it was first produced, during World War II, if you take any modern history, one of the things about World War II, the Allied powers just bombed Europe to the ground. The church where this painting is, the entire church is gone, except for this one wall. The Last Supper survived. Was it because of a miracle? Is there something significant about it? And in particular, just seated to the right of Jesus of Nazareth, is that John, the writer of the Gospel of John, or is that Mary Magdalene? It's a great question that we explore all the time because, well, Da Vinci didn't identify who each person was in the scene. Obviously, the central person is Jesus, and this particular Jesus looks much different than scientists say Jesus would have looked. He helps give a certain impression of what Jesus is supposed to look like, the standard of it. But due to the fact in the 19th century when some of the names were named, is people ask the question because John seems to have very, very feminine qualities, and because of the writer Dan Brown, 2003, writing a book called The Da Vinci Code, where he claims that Mary Magdalene was the bride of Jesus, as he tries to argue that there are certain elements of symbolism within the shape between Mary Magdalene and between Jesus, and this was not John, that Da Vinci, being brilliant on all things, that Da Vinci was part of all sorts of larger things in the world, and that he was trying to give symbols throughout this. So, yes, the Last Supper is still around. This is what it looks like now. The last restoration, the problem for Da Vinci on this one is that when he was tying a fresco technique, fresco was not one of his specialties, so he used oil paintings, and before the guy even died, is that most of the paint had started to flake off. This poor piece has been restored so many times. The last time they did a restoration, it took 21 years, where other artists came in and tried to get all of the exact colors. This is what it currently looks like, but a very vivid image of the experience of the apostles learning about the betrayal that Jesus was about to experience. So two other pieces that Da Vinci is very well known for. One, the Vitruvian Man. This was a piece they sketched out in one of his many, many notebooks in the year 1485 of trying to show a human. It's a throwback to the Greek philosopher Vitruvius, of looking at elements of proportion and how certain patterns exist over and over within nature, and that there is a certain rhyme and reason and a pattern to it all, as he's trying to show elements of the human proportions of having Vitruvian Man in two different positions. What he's trying to lay out is to give a challenge to artists that there are exact elements to the proportions of the human body that are in flux with, not in flux, but in sync with elements of nature, and to challenge artists to do more realistic portrayals, particularly with portraits. And one of his absolute masterpieces, 1503, when he produced the Mona Lisa. What is supposed to be enchanting about her is her smile. Nobody had quite done a smile with that, and the question is, what's she thinking about? And there's been all sorts of speculation on this. There's also people who claim that with the way her eyes are done, is if you walk around the room that she is in, that her eyes follow you a bit. We'll put it this way. Where this particular piece is in Paris, France, at the Louvre, yes, you could have opportunity to try to walk around and see the Mona Lisa. Good luck. There are going to be crowds all around it. My recommendation, this is a beautiful rendition of the Mona Lisa. This is all you really need to see. The room that it's in the Louvre, every single wall, some of the most beautiful pieces I've ever seen done of angels before, and crowds will come around Mona Lisa to try and get a chance to see her real close, and you can't get all that close. This is good enough. It's a great painting. The background, the perspective, everything about it has some amazing facets to it. But if you get a chance to go see the Louvre, you need several days to see the entirety of the Louvre. It's a huge place. Check out the other pieces on the wall. They're amazing. So, outside of this artwork, what else was Leonardo da Vinci famous for? So, some images from his sketchbooks. This is Leonardo da Vinci trying to design airplanes, helicopters, and a friggin' tank. These are all things that are not going to be designed and put into place until the 20th century. But way back here in periods of the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci is predicting elements of the future. He's sketching things out. He's a man beyond his times. There's been entire TV shows done about him, trying to recapture elements of his life. And while they're mostly fiction, it brings a certain sensation to a man who has gone down throughout history, known as the Master. With our module this week, I'm going to attach a short book. It's one of the first books that the great psychologist Sigmund Freud ever wrote. Book. It is a psychobiography of Leonardo da Vinci, where Freud, like many people, have postulated since then, asking, okay, if you were the most talented human being all the time, where did that come from? And Freud's choice is always asking, what was your childhood like? And so it's a very short book where Freud tries to explore unique elements of the life and times of Leonardo da Vinci in his youth that helped bring about this type of product in his future. So the two key figures to elements of Renaissance thought and what will come to be known as England are the philosopher and lawyer Sir Thomas More and the literary and theatrical character of William Shakespeare. So if you think about Sir Thomas More is caught in a major flux that we'll study in one of our upcoming lectures called the Protestant Reformation. He is a lawyer, he's a philosopher, he is advisor to King Henry VIII, and King Henry VIII will be the one who helps to implement elements of the Reformation within England, declaring the creation of a new church called the Anglican Church, with him being head of the Anglican Church. And Sir Thomas More was a Catholic and stayed a devout Catholic. He was actually executed by King Henry VIII. But as an advisor to the king, he saw all these huge changes going on with Reformation, Counter-Reformation, violence, and all of these things. And he's like, man, is there some way we can improve human society? So he wrote a book entitled Utopia. Utopia is it's a vision about a small island, and utopia being a word for a perfect society. It was a society in complete harmony and where people lived side by side with each other in peace, because the political ruler over their society, much like the one envisioned by Plato as a philosopher king, was somebody who ruled in an enlightened way that brought together the interests of all members of society. What Sir Thomas More put up in his own time, in a time of huge violence and flux, was the notion that human beings could improve the world around us. Now that's going to help to lay the groundwork for the great playwright William Shakespeare. Shakespeare has entire courses about him. He's an actor, he's a poet, he's a playwright. What he's going to do is he looks at elements about history and tries to romanticize and to tell the story of great leaders, whether it's Julius Caesar, whether it's his rendition about the Danish prince Hamlet, stuff with Macbeth, King Lear, but also classical stories of love like Romeo and Juliet. What's intriguing is that he always overlaps aspects of what we call fantasy genre with magic, different aspects of an internal love. But also, if you read Macbeth, so much of what's going on within there is an exploration of psychology and the inner mind. As a young prince who is torn, not Macbeth, Hamlet. He's got so many that he wrote. Yeah. Internal mind, is it I must be cruel to be kind. A person who's having these internal struggles, and literally kind of going insane because he swears that he sees ghosts of his father. What's here is what is groundbreaking. It's not just the extent of how much William Shakespeare produced, it's that he took it and he brought it forward into popular culture. The London of Shakespeare's time was not this beautiful, opulent city that people went to go see all these amazing things. The place was a crime-ridden, mud-filled shithole. And in his Globe Theatre, as he opened it up to all of society. Prior to this, things like plays and stuff, these were things produced for people up here, the elites, is he had what we would call the cheap seats. If you were on the floor, general admission, the seats were really cheap. People would come in drunk out of their minds, and he would attempt to enlighten them with culture. What both of these men believed is that society could be inspired to become better, and that we could build a better world right here, not waiting for a later spiritual salvation from Jesus, but human beings intervening in the societies around them to make this life better and more fulfilling. So, how on earth is anything with the Renaissance associated with elements of science? Is what we'll see is that Renaissance thinkers, instead of thinking about a spiritual salvation and afterlife and something up here needing to intervene to make things better down here, as they said, whatever is up here gave us great gifts to figure out the world around us, to inspire more authentic and more fulfilling lives. And as the Renaissance started bringing forward some of the thoughts from the past, as people we'd identify as scientists decided to step forward and say, this way that we understand the world around us, based upon Roman Catholic teachings, is not true, and that science can quantify that. So, Copernicus and Galileo are oftentimes misunderstood, as they say, oh, Copernicus and Galileo, they're the ones who realized that the Earth revolved around the sun. That is not true in any way, shape, or form. The Greek philosopher Aristarchus figured this out in the year 240 BCE. It's just the problem is he was working in the city of Alexandria. The Greek pharaoh at the time, Ptolemy, considered himself to be a bit of an amateur astronomer, and the pharaoh at the time said, no, everything revolves around the earth. And Aristarchus went, fine, I'll stop publishing other things. But that knowledge base was kept alive throughout scientific civilizations, and as Europe was going through the medieval era, Islamic scientists kept those traditions alive and expanded upon them with more evidence. So, what does Copernicus do? He's an expert at elements of European traditions of math, also based upon elements of math that were brought forward by Islamic scholars and Arabic. He blends together elements of the different traditions in looking at how things revolve around by looking up in the sky, and he comes up with a wonderful hypothesis that he has a lot of good support for, is that the earth revolves around the sun versus the sun and everything else revolve around the earth. Now, this was central because much of the way the Pope gained his legitimacy is said that the earth was a special creation of God, human beings were also a special creation of God, and that I, as God's representative, am literally the center of the universe. And don't question that model because it undermines my papal authority. Here's the thing, Copernicus realized that if he published such things, that the Pope would excommunicate him and have his soul condemned. So he waited until 2 weeks before he died and published a book called The Revolution of Heavenly Spheres, where he blended elements of going all the way back to Aristarchus. He looked at elements of what Islamic scientists had been doing, and he added in his own math, and he said math shows through equations that everything revolves around the sun, not that everything revolves around the earth. The reason why I waited until 2 weeks before he died is that wasn't enough time for the Pope to react to excommunicate him. And so scientists, they knew these things. The publications were out there. We're just waiting for somebody to have the guts to use a brand new invention called the telescope to bring forward a theory. And that's what's important to understand. A scientific theory is not just like, oh, because science has to be falsifiable. So if other evidence came forward to say that, okay, well, not everything revolves around the sun, well, that's how science works. Science, when it comes to scientific theory, is that you've gathered enough evidence that people can repeat the exact same experiment and have the outcomes be the same every single time. So if somebody says the theory of evolution, people are like, oh, well, that's just a theory. No, that's because every time people take the data and they repeat the scientific evaluation of the data, it comes up with the same concept and outputs every time. So Copernicus puts forward the hypothesis, Galileo pulls out the Copernican math, pulls out his telescope, tests it, and comes up with a theory that can be repeated over and over. Now, here's what Galileo is going to do, is he says, you know what, the Pope has been holding on to this for too long. My goodness, humanity has known this information for 1,800 years. Can we just make it mainstream? So in 1632, he publishes what is called the Dialogue of Chief World Systems, where he compares heliocentric, which means things revolve around the sun, versus geocentric, things revolve around the earth. And he said nothing with math or telescope observations can support the idea that things revolve around the earth. Everything shows that things revolve around the sun. And he was immediately brought forward by the Pope, and the Pope said, "You have committed heresy. I'll give you an opportunity to recant. Take that book, rewrite it, stick with the geocentric stuff, and you'll be fine." And Galileo says, sure. So it went back, and he doubled down on his stuff and kept publishing. And the Pope declared him a heretic in 1633, had him excommunicated from the church, and was put under house arrest for the rest of his life. Which some people go, oh, that's so horrible, house arrest. They let him still have paper and pen and his telescope. Intellectuals like to call that an enforced sabbatical. And he spends the rest of his life quantifying these things to make sure that these things go forward, to make sure that the Roman Catholic Church cannot have a monopoly on ideas anymore. Put it this way, Galileo was finally forgiven by the Roman Catholic Church in the year 1995 by Pope John Paul II, because he finally lifted the excommunication, which meant that finally Galileo's soul, wherever it was, according to Catholic doctrine, was no longer in a place of torment and could potentially enter into heaven if God found him worthy. Now, what we'll see, the Renaissance unleashed elements of humanism. Humanism led to scientific theory. Scientific theory led to the Catholic Church starting to lose control over the world of ideas. So, what are the results of the Renaissance? So, first and foremost, the Renaissance helped bring forward a concept of what I would call inspired propaganda. Now, to keep the word propaganda in mind, it usually has a dirty, bad, nasty connotation because we think of the 20th century. We think of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong, all these things, people manipulating and brainwashing you. And that's not what propaganda is. Those things that people brought forward in that is a form of propaganda. Propaganda is simply a way of educating people's perceptions of the world around them, where you have a predetermined concept in your mind of how it's going to shape their views, because human beings are a product of the cultural and physical space around us. So for instance, a dentist, if a dentist tells you all about using fluoride, now are they going through and telling you all the different things about fluoride? No, they're giving you a predetermined education about fluoride, hoping that you will be convinced by that and that you'll use fluoride on your teeth and your teeth will be healthier. That's propaganda. Propaganda is an effective form of education, but it also can be used to brainwash people. But during this period, there was a confirmed commitment to the idea that life could be improved by transforming people's perceptions about life. That for far too long, people had bought into the ideas of St. Augustine and original sin, that human beings were born evil, that will always be evil, and that the only way we can have anything good is in the life after this life. Aquinas flipped that around and said, science and rational thought do not have to contradict elements of faith, and if we are given a great miracle of this life, carpe diem, seize the day and make it the best as possible. Now, it's not asking for people to go out with a hedonistic view of the world, that will come later on, but an idea that we could improve human beings through access to knowledge if we balanced out our spiritual and our secular life. And that it was okay. It was not heresy to read the ancient Greeks. It was not heresy to read stuff from Islamic scholars. It was not heresy to read the writings of Confucius, or to study the texts of the Buddhist monks, or to use math and observation to quantify elements of the natural world around us, and to use that knowledge to improve the human experience right here on this earth. So what we'll see as an end result is by building a college that was by building a culture that was okay with shifting to secularism, is that the Renaissance laid the basis for elements of the natural sciences to come forward and to open up what historians refer to as the era of the modern world. What Renaissance thinkers thought was that the Bible provided elements of an ethical and spiritual insight of what the nature is of human existence and how we should choose to interact with other human beings in a hope that when this mortal coil comes to an end, as Shakespeare might say, that we'll pass on to a better place. They'll say, but that doesn't need to contradict science, which provides insights into the natural world around us. Because if we remember our study of ancient religions, we came up with these different gods that were each attached to a different force of nature because we didn't have science to understand where lightning comes from. We don't have to say lightning comes from Zeus. We'll say lightning comes from electricity. So to give an example, in the tradition of Sir Isaac Newton, who is really known as the sort of founder of the modern scientific method of how you go out, you have a hypothesis, you test it, and you can come up with a theory based upon those elements of experiment. Sir Isaac Newton, his body has been laid to rest in Westminster Abbey in London. I've been there to his tomb before. So why would they take the founder of science and allow his body to be buried in a highly religious space? It's because he was an incredibly religious man, but he was also an incredibly scientific man. He said there doesn't have to be a conflict. So to give what might seem like an absurd example, if I wanted to figure out how to build a table, one might think that I would want to go investigate such things by speaking with a carpenter. So, if I wanted to build a table and wanted information from a carpenter, would I go to the Christian New Testament to learn how to build a table? Because Jesus and his father, they were carpenters. Probably not, because that's not the point of a text like the New Testament. The New Testament tells me something about elements of ethical and spiritual insight. If I wanted information about how to manipulate the natural world around me, I would go talk face to face with a carpenter who has trained and who has a methodical way of putting things together, not through the power of prayer, but through the power of a knowledge base and utilizing his own skills. Sir Isaac Newton says there does not have to be any contradiction between science and between faith. Keep that in mind, because as we go forward this next week, we're going to get a bit rocky, because some people are going to question some elements about faith with the Protestant Reformation. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Be well, enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next week for the Reformation.